edition of our Strategic Farming Let's Talk Crops 2026 edition. So we've going to be weekly here through the next couple of months, and I encourage you to check out our website to see what all the topics are that we'll be covering. Today, we're going to be covering a nitrogen loss topic. We all know nitrogen is an important issue, both economically and environmentally to the state in terms of water quality from the environment side and economics in terms of maximizing our production. So with that said, that's a really big topic, and I do want to make mention, we're going to put a link up here to kind of a big picture, everything included chance to learn about that is through the Advanced Nitrogen Smart series. There's an online course for that. We're going to be actually dialing into just a portion of that course today to have a discussion here. In the topic we're going to address today is more specifically about edge of field nitrogen loss management. So the technique or the strategies we can use to manage nitrate loss at the edge of field. So that's just one component in that really quite large topic. And so we'll put that a link to the Nitrogen Smart webpage so that you can, if it's of interest, get in there and kind of explore that topic more holistically and hit all the different subject areas. So again, we're going to focus in on edge of field. I'm Ryan Miller. I'll be moderating today's session. We want to give thanks both the extension for the program as well as our sponsors at the Minnesota Corn Research and Promotion Council, as well as the Minnesota Soybean Research Promotion Council. So thanks for their support. A couple of things here. Next week, do want to make mention, we'll be at the Minnesota Ag Expo having a live broadcast there from the show floor. So if you're out at Ag Expo, please stop by and get a chance. You might even get to get on the program. So we've got some people lined up, but always could use other folks stopping by. We'll be there on the trade floor setting up ahead of the show at 9 a.m. So if you haven't had a chance to register for that, please do. That's in Mankato this coming Wednesday. Well, Tuesday and Wednesday, sorry. That said, at the end of the program today, we will offer CEUs, so stay tuned if you need those. We're going to be using the CCA app for that. We'll put up the QR code and give you a chance to automatically register for CEUs if that's something you need. With that, I am now going to introduce our speakers. So we've brought two guests to cover this topic today. We've got Brad Carlson. It's a crops and water educator at the University of Minnesota Extension. Who does a lot of work. He's kind of the mastermind behind the whole Nitrogen Smart program area and the Advanced Nitrogen Smart sessions. And so this is very much his in his wheelhouse. And he's sort of the leader of that, all that. And then we want to bring in Jeff Strock from the Department of Climate or Department of Soil, Water, and Climate at the University of Minnesota. He's stationed at the Lamberton Southwest Research and Outreach Center. Jeff's done a lot of work with some of these technologies that help mitigate nitrate loss at field edge, and he's very much an expert in the field. So we've got those two guys to kind of facilitate the discussion today. And we're going to kind of kick things off, I guess, with Brad. And he's going to start in talking a little bit about the state nutrient reduction strategy and then get into some of the nitrogen loss mechanisms and some of that. So that's where we're going to start. And then we'll move into some of the Jeff's information and have a discussion. So just a reminder here, as things pop up, please take time to type your questions or comments into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. We'll be addressing those as we move through today. You can help lead our discussion also. So with that, we're going to kick it off over to Brad and get her started.
All right. Well, good morning, everybody, and thanks, Ryan. I wanted to start talking this morning about the state nutrient reduction strategy. I realize that people are online here to hear about edge of field practices, but ultimately speaking, this is kind of the driver of what's pushing a lot of this in Minnesota. And so I think, from a either a farmer or an ag professional standpoint, you have to kind of understand what we're trying to achieve here, and how it's going to play out in order to kind of feel for how how we're going to start implementing some of these practices across the state. So the nutrient reduction strategy, the original one came out in 2014. It was primarily to address issues related to hypoxia in the Gulf. However, Minnesota's nutrient reduction strategy actually included the additional goals of dealing with the other major watersheds in the state, which is the Red, which flows up into Lake Winnipeg as well as Lake Superior. The Lake Superior part wasn't that big of a deal because it mainly said it's pretty clean and let's keep it that way. However, it did establish initially the federal goals, which were fairly aggressive for the Mississippi River, which was to achieve a 45% reduction in the amount of nitrogen running down the Mississippi River, a 45% reduction in the amount of phosphorus running down the Mississippi River. And that goal actually was for all of the states. I mean, they wanted a 45% reduction from the river. The idea being if each state reduced it by 45, well, then it was reduced by 45. The Minnesota's nutrient reduction strategy was always set to have a rewrite in 2024 or 2025. And so that happened. I actually have a print copy sitting here. It's fairly large. This is the revised Minnesota nutrient reduction strategy. It's actually like over 300 pages, so it's quite the read if you're wanting to look at it. The goals for the Mississippi River have not changed. What has changed is, of course, there has been some progress. However, the goals for the Red River have changed drastically. Originally, the nutrient reduction strategy was looking at making like a 13% reduction in the amount of nitrogen running through the Red at the Canadian border. That's been changed to 53%. And they're also looking at a 50% reduction in phosphorus in the Red. And so those are pretty aggressive, particularly considering in that part of the state, we don't see large numbers anyway in some of those rivers. And so if you look at what's going to all be employed in order to achieve those goals, I mean, first of all, of course, everybody always asks, well, what are they doing in town? Okay, so yes, it deals with wastewater treatment plants and stormwater. On the urban side, of course, we're involved in agriculture. That's not our deal to have to worry about that. That's in the strategy. You can read about it if you want to. On the ag side, there's really three broad categories of practices to address the goals of the nutrient reduction strategy. And those are nitrogen management, nutrient management, which can only go so far. A lot of our university research indicates that, obviously depending on the year and the circumstance, but if you're really got your nitrogen management dialed into the exact amount of nitrogen you need for your crop, for specifically the corn crop, roughly speaking, about 2/3 of what's coming out of tile lines is actually from natural sources. And so what that means is you could not fertilize the crop at all, which of course would also probably mean you're going bankrupt. But you could not fertilize the crop at all, and you'd only see about a 1/3, a 33% reduction. So that doesn't get us to 45. And so nutrient management, while it's the simplest and the most cost-effective method of reducing nitrates in the water, can't be the complete answer because it won't get us there. So the other two broad categories are land cover. So this is using cover crops or extending crop rotations to include perennials, land retirement if there's sensitive land like putting it into CRP or crop or something of that sort. And then the other major category that we're talking about today are edge of field practices. And so, one way of thinking about it is this is a way to try and get the nitrate back out of the water once it's already in there. So if you look at the progress report that came out a few years ago, I think roughly 2020, 2021, on the nutrient reduction strategy, there's a feeling that we actually made some pretty good progress in the last 10 years based on reductions in the nitrate concentration in rivers and streams. However, a lot of that, pun intended, has been washed away because of all the increased rainfall. And so, it's similar to those of you who work in the pesticide world. You're familiar with the toxicity times the dose, equals your impact. Same thing applies here when it comes to the total amount of nitrogen. The concentration times the volume of water, equals the total amount of nitrogen running down the river. So if the concentration went down and the volume of water went up, the total amount of nitrogen is not going to change a whole lot. And so, um, and so from that standpoint, the total that was shown in the progress report was only a 6% reduction, but at least it's something. I mean, instead of 45, now we're dealing with 39.
So that is how it's going to work. We had a goal of 45. We've gotten 6. Now we've got to take up that remaining balance.
That's correct. And the similar thing is with the phosphorus has also made some really good progress. However, most of the phosphorus progress has been achieved relative to improvements in wastewater treatment plants. They've not ascribed a lot of that to changes in ag practices. So the bulk of what's also going to, and we're not here today to talk phosphorus, but the bulk of what's going to happen with phosphorus is probably going to have to involve ag changes in ag practices also. So one of the things though that interrelates here, and it's relevant at least to have it in the back of your mind. Over on that urban side, when we talk about wastewater treatment plants, they do have goals to reduce the amount of nitrate running out of the discharge from those plants. And they're making a lot of noise on how expensive that is. And there's been a lot of serious conversation about pollutant trading, about basically allowing those plants to continue to discharge. But they're saying, well, it's cheaper to do reductions on the ag side. So we'll pay for reductions on the ag side if we don't have to do this in the wastewater treatment plant. And so Minnesota has not had a aggressive pollutant trading program to this point. However, that's being talked about. And so those in agriculture, there might be the possibility to have some practices put in place that's paid for by somebody else.
So Brad, that's interesting. We did have a comment question kind of pop up here related to the 45% reduction strat or goal. And it kind of seems like an arbitrary number. Can you fill us in where did that number come from, this 45%
Yeah.
reduction? Why is it that number?
There is a national task force that was convened by the EPA a long time ago, like 20 years ago, that came up with that number. I will tell you, without getting into a lot of the nitty gritty, that there never was consensus in that group on what that number should be. And if you read the national strategy, you'll find that there's a large dissenting report that says we think it's actually this. The EPA did they simply settled on what the majority opinion was, and that was what the majority opinion was. And so, that's, if you want to dive into that, I'm sure there's all kinds of references online you can read on that. But basically that number was given to us by the US EPA. And so, as we're moving forward now, in Minnesota, we have a system that's the one water, one plan, and that's based on what we call a HUC 8 watershed. So HUC stands for Hydrologic Unit Code, and 8 means an 8-digit number. That's not important at all, except you'll hear professionals throw out it's a HUC 8 watershed. These watersheds are roughly speaking about, depending on where you're at in the state, you could say it's about one county in size. For southern Minnesota's size of counties, it's about 2 counties in size. But these plans were put in developed locally. And so they are for the purpose of achieving multiple goals and objectives. There's local goals, there's issues with local lakes, there's other stuff, excuse me, that are in those plans. But the state has been targeting clean water funds to achieve the goals of these plans. And so statewide, there's been quite an investment in in conservation practices. That's a change from early in my career. Almost everything came through NRCS, and now most of it's actually coming from the state. I mean, NRCS still plays a role here, and there still is federal farm bill funding for conservation practices, but a large chunk of what's happening in Minnesota now is coming through the state. And so locally, kind of the way these things have played out, if you go back over the last decade that, or plus that the one water, one plan stuff has been out there, a lot of what happened was kind of based on local priorities. You had local farmers and landowners who've always had these projects that they wanted taken care of, a water sediment basin, a waterway, who knows. And a lot of the local units, the SWCDs, the watershed districts, used this funding opportunity to take care of a lot of the kind of the pent up demand that was out there. And so that's a large part of what happened in the last decade. Now, moving forward, a lot of that stuff has been taken care of. And so, as we're kind of moving into the future of this, what we're going to see is a lot more targeted approach towards achieving some of these goals. It's less of who's been in our office, telling us they got an erosion problem they want fixed, and more of here's our environmental concerns locally, and here's the things we're going to need to do to address those. And so, as we look forward into the future, we do see that a lot of these edge of field practices are likely to be a big part of the solution. And so, from that standpoint, the farmers, landowners are going to be asking themselves, A, what are they? How do they work and how do they function? B, is this right for me? Is this something that I should be doing on my farm? And so that's going to be a large portion of what we focus on here this morning. And so we'll get into a little more on the specific practices here when we bring in Jeff. But I did want to talk just a little bit about the nitrogen cycle, because this is all relays how this became a problem and then how we're going to deal with it. So the largest pool of our nitrogen, is our soil organic matter. Like I said, we could eliminate nitrogen fertilizer and still have a big problem with nitrate loss. And a lot of that's just simply because we grow annual crops. I think a lot of people say, oh, it's corn's fault. Well, that's not really the case. Look at your dinner table. Almost everything you're eating is an annual crop. And so whether it's corn or a vegetable or something else, annual crops, you plant them in the spring, they die at the end of the year. And what we find is the organic matter in our soil mineralizes and releases nitrogen throughout the year. And so after harvest, you'll still accumulate nitrate in the soil, but there's no plant growing out there to take that up. And so that's an important part of the nitrogen cycle. Now, the loss processes of nitrogen primarily are going to be water-based. And so if the soil becomes completely saturated, basically two things happen. They can either the nitrate in the soil would denitrify, which is it turns itself back into a gas and goes off into the atmosphere. And the hope is it turns into N2 gas, which of course is the primary component in the atmosphere. It's what we're breathing into our lungs right now. The majority of the air on the earth is N2 gas. If it's not complete, it can turn into some kind of nitrous oxide, NOx, and that's considered to be a greenhouse gas, and we kind of want to avoid that. Then from the other angle, when it's completely saturated, it can go down. So particularly the extent to which we've identified the need for proper drainage to produce optimum crop yields and optimum profitability in our farm fields, the drainage systems provide a conduit for that water to get out of the fields. And so, roughly speaking, kind of obviously, it's it all depends, but roughly speaking, nitrate's going to move through the soil about 6 inches for every inch of drainage that we get from a farm field in our medium to fine textured soils. Coarse textured soils, it's going to move roughly about a foot for every inch of drainage. However, we don't see a lot of drain tile in the coarse textured soils. There you're dealing more with shallow groundwater in that instance. And so, from that perspective, you look at it does take a while because an inch of drainage, if you're looking at an acre inch coming out of a drain tile, that's a lot of water, and so it takes a while, and so the a lot of people have demonized drainage as being part of the problem, but it's also part of the solution because instead of that water just ending up in shallow groundwater, which is almost impossible to capture and do anything with, it's actually in a pipe and we can do something with it. And so that's where the edge of field practices come in. So probably time for Jeff to add a few words of wisdom to what I've been going on and on about here.
Perfect. Thanks for that intro, Brad. That was absolutely fabulous. I think you hit on all the really important points, and it was a good segue into sort of thinking about the edge of field practices that we have available to us, here in the state, and things that maybe are, a little bit newer for farmers to even think about and consider. And so we can talk a little bit about some of that. Also, you did mention some of that big word that depends, right? So much of what we're dealing with and working with really does depend on the climate conditions, the weather patterns that we get, whether it's what starts in the fall, this last fall, what kind of recharge we might have started getting after harvest, and then what does winter look like, how fast is our thaw in the spring, and those kinds of things. And so it's a really tricky thing to predict, the nitrogen loss that we may or may not get in any given year, but there's so many years worth of data collection that we've had over the years that we have some pretty good ideas about what may happen in any particular given year. I just want to reflect back too for people for thinking about the last number of years that we've had. 21, 22, 23 here in Minnesota, at least in the southern part of the state, we had some pretty severe drought. And when there's not a lot of water flowing out of the drainage systems, there's just not a lot of nitrogen loss that happens. And my predecessor in this realm, Dr. Giles Randall, who was over in Waseca, really had done some really great work, and Jeff Vetch and myself have kind of carried a lot of that on, and others at the university. But one of the things that we know when we have some of these drought kind of conditions is that we need to be aware that there may be residual nitrogen under those climate conditions that accumulates in the soil profile. And if we get sort of the perfect storm, if you will, and we get some wet conditions following some of those droughts, there might be some residual N that's left in the profile just because of poor crop production and uptake, and that gets flushed out. And so there can be sometimes a fairly large slug of N loss that happens, in years following drought conditions. We'll just say kind of that as a rule of thumb. Of course, during wet years, there can be quite a lot of nitrogen loss, but in some of those wet years, like we had, for example, in 2025, I would consider that, at least in the southern part of the state, that we had a fairly wet year. But the timing of that precipitation, the amounts of precipitation that we just did not get a lot of drain flow. We had some, but when we went through and did all of our analysis and computations from this year compared to, say, 2024, we had probably half the number of samples that we collected in 2025 compared to 2024, just because of the nature of the way that the rain fell. And so we didn't have a lot of tile loss. One of the things I will say, too, that is kind of unusual right now, I was traveling yesterday. I was up toward the Appleton, Benson area and driving back through the country roads, and saw two tiles that were flowing, here in the middle of January. I mean, we've had some really unprecedented warm winter weather recently, and so we didn't have a lot of deep frost early on, and so it doesn't surprise me that there has been some tile flow that has occurred, but fairly quickly, I'm sure that's going to stop once the ground freezes up again. Uh, so I have a couple of slides, two or three slides I'm gonna share here right off the top of the bat, and then we'll look at those, and then I'll stop sharing, and then maybe we can kind of go toward where people want to maybe ask questions and talk about some of these specific practices that I've worked on and can share more details of things that people might want to hear about. So let me set myself up here to share. All right. Figure out which screen to share here. Yeah, we'll share this one. And
We can see your wall. Oh, there you go.
yep, I was just trying to navigate around. So you can see that, Ryan, now?
Yep, yep.
Okay,
You're in
perfect.
presenter mode, but
Uh, let's see here. Um, which button do I push on there to get it out of presenter mode, Ryan?
uh,
Let's
Jeff, you
see.
should be able to go up to display settings.
Ah, there we go. Yeah, there we go. Can you see that now perfectly?
yep, that looks
Ah,
good.
great. Okay, so we've got five different edge of field practices that you see on the left side of the screen there. So we've got bioreactors, controlled drainage, we've got ditch management, wetlands, whether they're natural wetlands or constructed type of wetlands, and then saturated buffers. So we can talk about, certainly what they are, how do they work, where do they work, how well do they work, and one of the things, especially to be noted, is there are benefits and limitations. So anytime we talk about these things. And I've talked about this for years and years and years that these edge of field practices or even infield practices they're not silver bullets. If they were silver bullets, we'd have adopted them and solved our nitrogen and our phosphorus problems, and we wouldn't be having this webinar today. These are silver buckshot. They work and they work pretty well, but there are some limitations to some of these practices, and it's important to know that that they may not necessarily work on an individual farm. They may work on particular fields, and there is cost obviously associated with some of these things. So, super important to take all these things into consideration before kind of jumping off and actually implementing. So this slide here really reflects on the nitrogen issue. And so the data that you see there, this is from the original Minnesota nitrogen reduction strategy. These numbers will certainly be updated, but we're probably still going to be, for the most part, in the ballpark when looking at the different practices that I've got listed on that left axis, on the y-axis on this graph. Of course, along the bottom axis is the estimates based on agronomic research that has been done as to the expected load reductions for nitrogen that we might see. And you might recall, Brad was talking about nitrogen management, for example, and those are all the ones that you can see on that slide that are in brown. we can achieve some nitrogen reductions by looking at inhibitors, side dressing, and from switching from fall to spring. Certainly, a piece of the puzzle, but certainly not going to get us all the way to 45% reduction, just based on that. So then you can look at some of those the blue bars that I have up there. Those relate to, wetlands, controlled drainage, and bioreactors. Some of the edge of field practices that we actually had some data for when the original nutrient reduction strategy was devised. The ones that are in orange relate to some of the infield practices, and then the green ones really relate to more perennial, continuous living cover kinds of systems where you may have livestock, so you've got some pasture hay issues. Maybe somebody's growing some switchgrass for an energy crop. Certainly, Brad highlighted, land retirements, and so we may have some land in CRP. Certainly, these kinds of practices where we have perennialization, far exceed what's necessary for the achieving that 45% reduction. Of course, I think there was close to 140, 150 people listening today and participating. I obviously we don't know what proportion of those folks on there are farmers, but unless you have livestock, it's pretty unrealistic to consider or even think that we're going to change ag production here in Minnesota and just go to things that are really in the green bars, right? We need to go out. We need to plant row crops, corn, beans, small grains, things like that, and then up in the Northwest, more specialty crops. But so that just tells us that, if we're going to keep agriculture as a big player in the economic engine that makes Minnesota go, we've got to find some of these practices that can be implemented that can help us achieve some of these kinds of reductions. So again, I listed off those 5 bioreactors, controlled drainage, ditches, wetlands, and then saturated buffers. Now, when we think about those things, we can take a look at them. These are conceptual graphs. The one on the upper left just thinks about things from a nutrient reduction for nitrogen by practices. So the lower left would be indicative of just nutrient management. We're going to get some benefit, but if we scale up a little bit more and we implement some edge of field practices like controlled drainage or saturated buffers or things of that nature, we can achieve more reduction, and of course those perennials all the way to the right. That's one way to think about it. Probably the more appropriate way to look at it is what we look at on the lower right side, where we're doing nutrient reduction the best that we can, and then we start looking at in a watershed or in a farm field or on a farm, what's the most appropriate practices to start implementing, and then start to use the buffet approach and get a bunch of different practices on that landscape all at the same time. And that's probably more likely what's going to really help us achieve some of those nutrient reduction goals, is to implement multiple things on farms to be able to achieve some of those. So I don't know, Ryan, do we have questions popping up, or do you want me to maybe just launch into one of the strategies and talk a little bit about it?
Why don't we cover the strategies and that you mentioned on that first slide, and then we'll kind of come around again and have some more discussion.
Yeah, so I'll kind of fire through these, not going through massive amounts of detail, but I'll talk about maybe what some of the logistics are, and then we'll go through the benefits and limitations, and because otherwise I'll spend way too much time talking and not asking, or addressing questions that people have. So let's look at let's see if we can get this to go to the slide I want. So if we look at the bioreactors, this is kind of the first generation of the bioreactors. Um, Obviously, at an edge of field, filled with wood chips, which are basically used as a food source for carbon for the bacteria that live there. Um, these are really quite effective for the water that drains through the bioreactor. Those bioreactors, when the water's flowing through them, can remove, over 90% of the nitrate that flows through them. They have a relatively long residence time, meaning that the water needs to stay in those bioreactors for a fairly long period of time for the nitrogen reduction to happen. And we can see, possibly some situations where, the size of the bioreactor is going to depend on somewhat the area that you're trying to drain, things of that nature. The the
So
trying to get,
Jeff, is
yep.
there a rough estimate? Say I want to drain 40 acres through a control structure. How big does that bioreactor have to be, do you estimate? And
Yeah,
then,
so it all depends on where you build it, right? I mean, I right off the top of my head, I don't have a square footage kind of an idea here for you, Ryan, because a lot of these can be built right along ditches and the edges of fields, and so they end up being a trench that might be, 5 or 6 feet long and 6 feet deep, and the length depends on the area of the field that's going to be drained. Ordinarily, when we look at using bioreactors, we're not really looking at field sizes that are more than probably 50 or 60 acres. And the ones that we've installed and that I'm aware that are out there that are, they're probably anywhere from 100 to 200 feet long, some of them. So some of them are pretty sizable to be able to handle the larger flows that are in there. Go ahead,
And
Brad.
I know, Jeff, some of them that I've seen, and one way of conceptualizing this is to think of like the drain field in a septic system.
Yep.
And so you're talking about kind of long, narrow ones, and that's a good way to fit them into the landscape. There's others that some of the first ones I've seen that were a little bit more square than long rectangles, and so some of those were maybe 15 to 20 feet wide and maybe 40, 50 feet, long.
Yep.
And it really has to do with the square footage and what fits, so from that standpoint, farmers are able to kind of fit these into what they've got going on in the field. And while it does technically probably take some land out of production, it also affords the opportunity to square a field off, which is not necessarily a bad thing either sometimes.
but
Yep.
relatively,
Absolutely.
it's a small area relative to the area it's treating is kind of the
Yep.
concept. It's
Yeah.
not big.
Absolutely. You really customize it to the location that you have to be able to fit it in. Yeah. So let's see if this goes to, let me try to, we got to get to there we go. So the benefits and limitations. So like we were just saying, for bioreactors, there's minimal crop taken out of production. They don't require a whole lot of maintenance necessarily, other than recharging the wood chips or the carbon source that you've got in there. From time to time. There are also, as I said, there's a really pretty darn high capacity for the reduction of nitrogen. There has been some concerns and there has been some evidence about greenhouse gas emissions from these systems. And also, because we don't want to be trading problems, there had also been some questions about methylation of mercury And that scenario has been pretty much identified and solved. As I said too, during high flow, these systems are great unless you've got really high flows, and then under those conditions, you get a lot of bypass flow, and that water's not treated. The carbon source issues, when we first started these, and Brad, I don't know if you remember this, or Ryan, we got wood chips for free. People were giving them away. Now they've become more expensive, and there has been some questions about sustainability of having wood chips to be able to do these kinds of things if they were really, really widely adopted. So there has been some work. I know ARS has done some work here in Minnesota and Iowa with combinations of wood chips and corn cobs and things, and so different carbon sources have been used.
Well, I
It
think
might
part of that too, though, Jeff, some of them early ones were looking at like where utility companies were cleaning out under electric lines and then they chip all that stuff, and some of that material breaks down too fast, and so the high carbon dry sawdust from a sawmill is going to stay in place a lot longer than if it's full of leaves and bark and questionable material like sumac and so forth. And so part of that also is this trade-off between what's cheap and what's, in the long run, what's actually more cost effective, which is bringing in drier materials.
has
Yeah, you add on to that, Brad, some of what you already said too, also can kind of absolutely relate to the idea of, sort of the size of the material. You really want to be really careful not to get too fine a material like sawdust in there. The hydraulic conductivity, the flow through those would be kind of a disaster. So you've got to have fairly coarse materials.
you know
Right. And I think a lot of what we're seeing now is some of these chip pallets.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
you've got a lot of ash trees that are in the process of dying, so I don't know if that'd be a silver lining to that whole disaster. But hey, we did have one question about restricting water through a bioreactor. Does it get restricted at all, or is it more like you're saying, we get to capacity, it bypasses the reactor, and that's kind of the negative side of things?
Yeah, by and large, the restriction is really absolutely related to the amount of flow that's going through there. Unless you've got some sort of an issue, and we have seen some areas where in Minnesota and Iowa where we have had some subsidence, in those bioreactors, and that does restrict flow to some degree. And really, that subsidence is related to the fact that zones within a bioreactor can actually go through these cycles of wetting and drying and wetting and drying, and that enhances and accelerates the decomposition of that wood chip in there. And so then you do get some of that subsidence, and then you can get smaller particles, which can to some degree maybe restrict some of the flow. But we haven't heard too many complaints about restricted flow other than that we just can't, farmers and people that use these get frustrated because they really want to treat more water, during those high flows. And these systems are great, but they have a limitation. They can't treat every drop of water that flows through the drain tile system.
So we did have a question. Is a wood chip? And we addressed that a little bit, Brad, with some of the things you mentioned. Is there a resource for folks looking at these that what like this combination is better for meeting your goals, or is there any kind
I,
of recipe?
Yeah, that's a absolutely fabulous question. So, myself and a group of scientists and engineers from around the Upper Midwest have put some put some guidelines for using these kinds of things out there. So they're like FAQs, so frequently asked questions about bioreactors and controlled drainage and things. So somebody can just go on to do a quick search on the internet for frequently asked questions about bioreactors, and they'll come up with some of those extension type of publications. In a real quick nutshell. There are some differences between some of the types of wood that's used, whether it's softwoods or hardwoods. And Particularly there were some research done where they were looking at some of the hardwoods. I think it was Indiana, where they were seeing a lot of more tannic acids come out of some of the hardwoods. So that imparts some of that darker color in the water. It doesn't mean that it's polluted. It's just because of the acids that come out of the different types of wood. But they're all pretty effective. Again, some of it does relate to, if you've got softer woods, the longevity of some of those softer woods is going to break down faster than the hardwoods.
All right. Well, I suppose we should keep moving here so we can hit the other strategies. We're a good part of the way through the program, so we'll keep
Yep,
moving here.
exactly. So, well, let's talk about controlled drainage. So, controlled drainage is a practice where you use a similar style of a structure in a field to basically uh, change the depth of the elevation of the water table, the shallow water table in a drained field. So ordinarily, here in Minnesota, we're putting our tile in at about 4 feet. Using these structures at the edge of a field, we can manipulate that in the field, raising it all the way to the soil surface or letting it drop all the way down during the growing season. There is cost associated with controlled drainage. So controlled drainage, normally you've got a narrower drain spacing. So if you're, say you're on a 100-foot spacing, you're down to 50 feet. If you're at a 70-foot spacing, you might be down to 35 feet to be able to make this practice work. So there is a cost associated with, more tile and putting these structures in. There is a really great water quality benefit to controlled drainage. We've seen 50% reductions in nitrogen and phosphorus actually when using controlled drainage. So we do see some pretty dramatic differences there. In the older style of control structures, they were all manually operated. So they basically had a log piece of plastic that you had to manually raise and lower during different parts of the year. Now I know that there are companies out there that have automated ones. So you can use an app or use your computer, and you can sit at your desk and control those structures, from wherever you're at. And some of them have sensors to tell you how much flow is happening, and they have a lot of little bells and whistles on them that make them really, really nice. From a yield benefit standpoint, we like to think of controlled drainage as a win-win. We've published a couple of papers, one for corn and one for soybean, across multiple locations in the Midwest and many, many years of data. And on average, we don't see a difference in yield from controlled drainage to conventional drainage. However, for corn and for soybeans, when we have moderate drought conditions, controlled drainage can increase yields anywhere from say 5 to 15%, just because of the nature of the way the system works. So under some of these moderate drought conditions, controlled drainage can have a pretty big yield benefit. If you get an extreme drought, the controlled drainage is not going to help you because the crop's going to use most all of that water up and still be suffering.
So, so I think what's important to realize about controlled drainage is the data kind of shows it doesn't really reduce the amount of nitrate in the water. What it's reducing is the amount of water.
Yep.
So back to what I talked about with the river flows. But the other aspect of that is that we are looking at water storage goals in a lot of our watershed plans for the sake of flood mitigation, but also because we've got a lot of issues with stream bank erosion in some of our southern Minnesota streams. We're looking at trying to hold water on the landscape. So this particular practice may actually achieve multiple goals in a watershed. And so particularly in certain places, it's probably going to be preferred, and it's well suited to flat landscapes. And so we're likely to see a lot more of this up in the Red River Valley too.
Absolutely, and Brad, you just kind of touched on it here. When you were mentioning this kind of idea of it's not necessarily affecting the actual concentration of nitrogen, but it is a drain flow volume. So that's the benefits here. And as I've said, we do get some phosphorus benefits. Under limitations, there are potentially some impacts that could be negative on the crop production. So if you're using manual structures, we've seen this before. I've experienced it myself. Under wet conditions, if you don't go out and manage your drainage system properly, you can actually hurt your yields by leaving too much water in the field, pruning roots and creating some negative conditions in the soil where you can actually reduce yields. There are some system maintenance and management things. Where you would put controlled drainage, these fields have to be either tabletop flat or the tile have to be put in on a contour. So there's some considerations for tilers when doing that kind of thing. And as I said, we can see some modest yields and increases in yields, and they work well under these drought conditions. Let's see. Let's see if we can get this to go to the next slide. Oops. Yeah, here we go. So we'll talk about saturated buffers here. So saturated buffers are again an edge of field type of a practice. Really somewhat similar to having a bioreactor at the edge of the field, only you're using the soil and you're using the vegetation and the root systems and the carbon that are there to actually do the nitrogen reductions. So some of these have been installed, not many in Minnesota, but some of these have been installed in Minnesota, a lot more in Iowa and some other states. We can see where there are some really dramatic benefits similar to those of bioreactors, where we can get upwards of 90% reduction early on. On average, we've seen probably about a 50% reduction in the water that flows through these. There are some considerations when putting in a saturated buffer that you have cohesive soils. So these would not work particularly well where we have some sandier, coarser texture soils because these end up being put in, along a stream or a ditch in those buffer zones, and so we have to be kind of careful about putting those in and making sure that we have some stable banks to be able to put these in. There's also considerations for how many lines that are put off of these saturated buffer systems, and making sure that we don't go into areas where there are trees, because there have been some issues where we've seen where root systems can get into the tile and create a little havoc there as well.
So
Go
basically,
ahead.
Jeff, what we're looking at here is we're discharging the water into a buffer strip, and then we're using the perennial plants growing in that buffer strip to actually use that nitrogen up before it's ending up in surface water. And so, like a lot of these practices, there's certain landscapes that are going to be more amenable to this practice than widespread. But I know, like my personal, because of some of my experience, I look at, for instance, eastern Rice County, where there's not a lot of wetlands and surface water, but there's a lot of tile drainage. That might be a landscape that's well suited for something like this.
So, so
Well, yep,
does
absolutely, Brad.
so the water enters the buffer through a pipe, I imagine, and it sits there. Does it have an exit then, or is it just sitting in the buffer and saturating it and gradually flowing into the stream or ditch?
Exactly. It basically re-enters into the shallow groundwater through that. So the pipe that allows the system to work is upstream of the outlet. So the outlet is basically just saturating a buffer, just saturating the soil, and then allowing that to basically gravity flow back down into the ditch or the stream. And so that's why we call it saturated, right? Because we're not directly piping it out. We're redistributing. So the pipes that are used in this are sort of redistribution pipes, and those redistribution pipes then set up that water laterally along these buffers, and then allow that water to flow into the buffer, and then through the buffer it back into the stream. Um,
So other
And
than
like
the
bioreactors, there is a bypass for if the water backs up too far,
yep,
and where it will directly discharge then into the stream.
so
absolutely, Brad.
other than weeds and woody vegetation on these saturated buffers, do you have to manage the vegetation in any fashion or?
Nope. Nope, there
Right.
has not been. I know that there's a couple of sites that they've established recently in Iowa where they've established some sites where they've been looking at different types of vegetation to see if there's some benefits of these different types of vegetation out there, Ryan. But that's still pretty early on research, and I have not seen any of the results from some of that work yet.
I think it's worth noting, though, that from a nitrogen standpoint, I don't think it's very important. However, from a phosphorus standpoint, the research has indicated that phosphorus will accumulate in buffer strips. And so, if the grass is not harvested and removed, eventually you're going to end up with larger discharges of phosphorus into water from buffer strips. And so, I think from that standpoint, I think people have to be aware that haying and removal of the grass from buffer strips periodically, maybe not annually, is part of proper management of buffers.
Excellent.
Perfect.
All right. Well, we're getting close to the end here, so we better keep moving.
Yep. So let's get in. So we'll talk about ditches. I'll just jump to the design management thing. So, ditches, there's a lot of opportunity. We've got about 20,000 miles of ditch in Minnesota. This is not something that has been really popularized a lot here in Minnesota. So there are a couple ways to manage ditches. One is the concept and the idea of two-stage ditches, where you create a low flow channel and a floodplain essentially in a ditch, so you over widen it. There's one down in Mower County, I believe, and then there's a number of these in Indiana. They've been shown to be very effective in reducing nutrients, and actually also creating a little bit of, as Brad said, some of this storage space for sort of reducing peak flows. So, there are some benefits to that. The other ways that we've looked specifically at ditch management here in Minnesota, a lot of the work that I've done, we allow the ditch to just be maintained the way it is, and then we use, for example, like rock weirs to create maybe like a 1 foot elevation change in a ditch to slow water down, create a little bit of a pool behind that to create a zone of denitrification. And we've seen reductions in ditches that are, actually more than 50% reductions in nitrogen and phosphorus. Here in the state with some of the work that we've done. There can be some reduced maintenance costs, although you've got to be really careful in any of these practices by the fact that if we've got surface runoff and erosion, whether through, an infield, pothole that's drained, or surface runoff that moves any kind of sediment in any of these practices, whether it's a bioreactor, a saturated buffer in the ditch, even in a wetland that we haven't gotten to, sediment leaving the landscape is bad because it creates a lot of problems for any of these edge of field types of systems. The one negative about thinking about ditch management, especially when we consider the idea of a two-stage ditch, is that they are over widened, so they do take land out of production, and so there's some caveats with thinking about that. Um, Since we're running low on time, I'm just going to hop to the wetlands, and we'll think about wetlands and constructed wetlands. They have multiple benefits, not just ag water quality, but also aesthetics and wildlife habitat types of things. They do a great job in mitigation of sediment and nutrients. They are great storage places on the landscape so they can reduce some of those peak flows, sequester carbon. Again, though, if you have to construct or reconnect a piece of land into a wetland, sometimes those best places are in the middle of farmers' fields, and so that's not a conducive place because it interrupts farming. But if you've got some areas along edges of fields or places that are less productive in a farm field that you can actually build one of these things, there are some opportunities. But again, our goal is to make sure farmers can farm, not to take land out of production when we're thinking about, doing these water quality edge of field practices. So, Ryan, I better stop there because I see it's already 10 o'clock.
Okay, well, thanks, Jeff, and thanks everyone who's asked questions. We're kind of running out of time here. We do have a couple of questions, but we're going to have to kind of save these, and we'll take what's left here and try to answer those in some fashion. I see Brad's typing a couple of questions or answers, but with that, we're really going to have to wrap things up. I want to thank everyone for attending today. Again, thank our sponsors at the Minnesota Soybean Research and Promotion Council and Minnesota Corn for some of their support. And again, we do have this program every week here, same time frame. If you can't make it, we do a written kind of write-up of what is discussed, as well as there's a YouTube or podcast version, I guess I should say, where you can take that in and see the information that way. But again, tune in every week if you want, or look at the list of topics and select where you're going to be at. Next week, we're going to be live there at the trade show floor at the Minnesota Ag Expo, so we'll see you there. And I want to thank our guests for Brad and Jeff for helping kind of lead us through this discussion today. So thanks again.